we'll keep the plane flying here. As I said, hopefully we can zip through this first renal module. It's a shorter module than the usual 180 slides or something like that. And so the discussion is to continue on, again, looking at this thing functionally, looking at it functionally from a perfusion standpoint, and then functionally from a nephron filtration standpoint, if you will. So blood supply. As we said before, we talked a little bit about our afferent arterial coming from our systemic blood supply. You got a right and left renal artery shooting across, and then eventually subset, getting down to this arterial level at the capillary bed. The key is, though, this is one of the spots where we've talked about having two capillary beds in sequence, if you will. So essentially this, what's unique about this piece, though, is you have two capillary beds, but you also have two different pressure systems, if you will, versus some of the other portal systems. The pressures aren't all that different. So anyways, as that blood comes in, obviously it's pushing through everything into the nephron, into Bowman's capsule, and then eventually what is not sneaks out this efferent, and then it's making its way down to the proximal convoluted tubule, which is the first part of this nephron. And if you think about it, everything just got filtered, dumped into it, and now it's going to go through this proximal portion of it. And so this is a site where there's a lot of reabsorption going on. In other words, you throw it all into the nephron, and then you pull back 99% of it and only excrete every teeny percent, if you will. It's kind of the MO for the filtration system. So that's the piece of it, but eventually as it goes through this capillary bed, it finally makes its way back into the venous system as far as overall flow. Meanwhile, another thing to discuss as far as this glomerulus is a signaling mechanism. The JGA, juxtaglomerular apparatus, is made up of these JGA cells and also this macula densa cluster of specialized cells, too, if you will. So these JGA cells are located in this junction, and it's a pretty ingenious system, essentially. This is a feedback mechanism, but it's a local feedback mechanism. So here you've got information coming in, you've got blood coming into the filter. So you have this feedback system of the capillaries themselves and these cells around it too as well. They sense what's going on pressure-wise of what's getting dumped into the filter. But the other beauty of it is this is a distal convoluted tubule. So in other words, the filtrate came in, makes its merry way around the proximal, makes its merry way around the loop of Henle there, and then it comes back and passes through right next to the entry of all this filter system to give some feedback to say, okay, this is what the filtrate looks like. So it's kind of a local update at an individual nephron level of how that nephron's functioning or doing, if you will. And so these cells, these macula densa cells, they're in the wall of this thing, and what they do is detect sodium passing through it. And so the amount of sodium represents the amount of filtering that's going on. So if you have a high filter rate or a slow filter rate, you're going to have a large amount of sodium or a low amount of sodium. So it uses that as a signaling mechanism to then in turn tell the arterioles what to do, and also to release renin and some of the more global signaling hormone pathways. So that's the JGA. Again, as usual, 2 or 3 images to kind of support the visual piece of that that discussion. This is Netter's version of it. So a nice, pretty visual, but again, this is the content of that distal convoluted tubule. So whatever the filter function of that nephron is, these cells are picking it up and providing some feedback to either increase or decrease GFR, or your filtration rate, if you will. The mesangial cells, I already chatted about these guys. Just to reinforce, they're located within this Bowman's capsule network, if you will. You have Bowman's capsule and the opening or entrance to this nephron. You have the tubing of the blood vessel, but you also, between them, have the mesangial cells. And as I said, they're a double function, smooth muscle, phagocytic, so they have a phagocytic role, but that smooth muscle role, again, is to either relax and allow more surface area of capillary space, or contract and narrow that filtration space down. So kind of just reinforcing what I had chatted about before. All right, Bowman's capsule. We eventually will talk about the thrills and spills of the mechanics of filtering. If you think about it, blood pressure makes a difference. Also, the actual physical pressure of this space in here, the beginning of the nephron, known as Bowman's space, and the mechanics, the sum total, determine how well this is going to filter, how fast it's going to filter or not going to filter. So that's the glomeruli, that's the entrance. Now we'll just talk very generically about the nephron. Again, I think everybody's familiar what a nephron is. But as I said earlier, it's divided up into three chunks, if you will. The proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, and then last, the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT. Each of them kind of has a functional, specialized role, if you will. So we'll briefly talk about those today. Then Module 2, we get into the little dirty details, a little more close-up for each. But knee-jerk reaction for proximal or PCT. As I said earlier, resorption, resorption, resorption. So think of it simple. That filter, that glomerulus, dumps everything in, or as much as humanly possible. Glucose, sodium, bicarbonate, you name it, as much as whatever it's getting rid of or thinks the body wants to get rid of. Then it's up to the nephron to pull back as much as it thinks it should appropriately. So it's a major, major site for reabsorption. Obviously, sodium, huge role in the body, and it also represents a functional role in this nephron. So huge site of absorption here, but we'll talk a little bit about further down the line too as far as sodium's role in getting back in the bloodstream. But it's the initial site. Everything else, in simplistic terms, things like glucose and all that stuff, a good 99% or 95% of it, gets pulled back here. So again, anything damaging this portion of the nephron, huge function as far as the ability to pull all this stuff back, obviously. All right, loop of Henle. Looking at this, just two different discussions. It's plays a huge role in concentrating urine, but that's only for those nephrons of this juxtamedullary nephrons that we had talked about. So only about 10 or 15% of them go way down into that pyramid, that medulla section, have these long loops that you classically remember from your discussion of what a nephron does. And it's that countercurrent mechanism, we chatted about it, but that's the site for concentrating this urine. Give you a little intro as far as concentration. It comes in at a certain level, and basically as it makes its way down, the descending and the ascending loop allow different things to go through and other things not to go through. And as it goes down, water is allowed to be pulled out, so it gets more and more concentrated as it gets pulled down here. Then it changes as you work your way back. But eventually, when you get back up here, it gets diluted again. So the kidneys, literally in this loop, they go from taking out whatever its value was coming in, it makes it super concentrated. Then on the way out, it actually dilutes it beyond its entering phase. And then last, that collecting duct is the final kind of fine-tuning of it. So that's just a very generic overview. We'll talk about numbers and everything in Module 2. So anyways, those that are located near the medulla, this juxtamedullary nephrons, huge role as far as concentration. The shorter roles are the other ones. If I get to it, obviously they don't play quite such a big role. There is some reabsorption that's going on more in the second half of it as far as function goes. All right, DCT, looks like I didn't give the D here, but that should be a D. Distal convoluted tubule, kind of an interesting function. It's involved in a few different things, and they split it into kind of two functional parts, the beginning piece and the end piece. And I guess I should say, too, is by definition, the DCT really begins at that macula densa site. Remember we said the feedback mechanism? Put it all in here, did a lot of reabsorption, did some concentration, and then the status of that is picked up by those macula densa, and they're telling those arterial or the filter what to do next on a very immediate reflexive kind of role. But after it gets past that, it's known as the DCT. And so the first portion has a little different function than the end portion. The end portion really acts like a collecting duct. The beginning portion acts more like a quote-unquote convoluted tubule. But as I said earlier before, as this solute goes through, it's super concentrated, and then it begins this process of diluting. And when it gets up to the DCT, it continues to ultra-dilute it, if you will, to a certain point. And then in the second half is the final fine-tuning, where it actually goes back into being a concentrated urine. And that's what goes on in the second half of it and in the convoluted tubule as it makes its way down to that renal papilla we had talked about. So that's a functional overview. As I said, the collecting duct is the final discussion as far as water going in and out. We talk about ADH and aldosterone, and that's where those guys are working. Aldosterone and the ADH in the second half of the DCT on that collecting duct. If they're making something more water permeable, ADH, that's where it's acting to allow more fluid to get back in and get your BP up and get your blood volume up. All right, so that's the overview. Circulation. We've chatted about it a little bit. Not sure where we need to go other than you should just simply recognize the pathway, but I don't think there's anything to add here we haven't already talked about. On this slide, I would like to emphasize a little bit difference between these two scenarios, function-wise. We have these short nephrons, and we have these long ones that are involved in concentration. All of them have a glomerulus, all of them have an efferent arteriole, but then the short ones basically just have peritubular capillaries. In other words, the capillary bed that goes around the PCT and the DCT to allow reabsorption to go on. But then on those long juxtamedullary ones, the ones with that real long loop of Henle getting in that little pyramid, that's involved in concentration. Those of you that remember your physiology of counter gradient pathways between the inside and outside of this loop of Henle going on, or countercurrent gradients. That's what this vasa recta is involved with, is, again, that whole concentration, dilution, equilibrium of this loop of Henle. So that's very simplistic. The peritubulars, basically the reabsorption, and I guess I left it off the list, PCT, there's still some secretion that does go on, and different meds go through there too as well. So, you know, it's not all the filter. There is some ability to secrete into this duct system. All right, so that was kind of a functional overview. I think I got ahead of myself on the slides. That's essentially what each of these slides were doing, is just differentiating between those peritubular portion of the shorter ones and then the longer ones with the peritubular and the vasa recta. All right, pressure system, pretty easy. In fact, I'll sneak through. Oops. Are you okay? Are you okay, 911? All right. All right. The pressure system, we want to get from here to here, no different than any other capillary in the body. You go from your 90s, your 100s, and 120s of coming out of the aorta. You get down to your arterial level. Remember, said those arterials, take them from the 90s into the low double digits, and eventually to the capillary venous return. Venous return, single digits, 4s, 5s, 3s, those kind of numbers getting back to the IVC. So what goes on in between? The first capillary network is quote-unquote high-pressure system. High pressure in the sense of you're talking, it comes in at about 45, so numbers 44, 45, 46, and it pushes it through, and it doesn't change a whole lot. It just drops 1, 2, or 3 millimeters of mercury, if you will. So bless you, that's the first capillary bed. So it's high pressure to encourage, obviously, filtration. That's what's going on. After that, it goes into your standard capillary bed type numbers. So you're going to drop way down to your single digits. So it's going to drop down into your 8s, your 9s, your singles, and eventually into your venous return. So moral of the story is just recognize the pressure gradient through the nephron as far as the blood vessel goes. And function-wise, obviously that's higher to encourage filtration. Talk about kidney shutdown, mean arterial pressures, things falling below 50 to sustain visceral organs. Think about it here is if you've got MAP levels or pressure levels dropping down to shock and below 40, you simply don't have a filter pressure. So, obviously your kidney's shutting down. So, mechanically it should add up to what you see clinically. I guess that's the moral of the story. All right, blood flow. Like to talk a little bit about rates, kind of a transition. Again, I'm not standing here telling you what normative values are for, kidney function and blood flow function for kidneys, but you should have a basis, just like we did with the cardio stuff. So as the blood makes its way down the aorta, right and left renal artery, and essentially how much of it's going to wind through. Go back to way back cardio days, 5 liters a minute was your cardiac output. Well, 1.2 liters, 25%. So a fifth or a fourth of it is going through your filter system of your kidneys. And it kind of makes sense functionally as far as what it needs to do. So the first thing is terminology. Renal blood flow, and that's just referring to blood as a whole, not plasma, about 1.2 liters per minute. So there's the first number to hang on to. Next thing you want to do is look more functionally. Obviously, red blood cells aren't going through that whole fenestrated thing we talked about of a filter. So we want to look at the plasma that's actually being pushed through this filter system and the number of it. So essentially, you want to take out your red blood cells. So using your hematocrit value, you just simply, if you got a 40% hematocrit, 60% of it is the plasma flow through it. So that's where this number comes from. The example I gave was, someone with a 45% hematocrit, which means 55% of it, is your plasma that's pushing through. So typical average values per minute, 600, 700 mLs. So a little over a half of that Coke bottle is pushing its way through every minute to be filtered out. So calculation-wise, just like cardio, you should be able to calculate, a renal plasma flow based on somebody's hematocrit or based on their renal blood flow to problem solve. All right, last but not least, how well is this thing filtering? GFR, glomerular filtration rate. Healthy individual, about a fifth or 20% is a typical functional value for good kidney, filtration, if you will, or average. So we pushed 600 mLs, 700 mLs of plasma through there, but only about a fifth of that actually gets into the nephron itself. So filtration rate is based on that number. So if we know that 20% is kind of our average norm, if you will, if we know that renal plasma flow is 700, 600, you just plug the two in and do the math, and you come up with a number of about 120, 110, 130 mLs per minute that are going on. What's fascinating going on out there? Just, Worcester, you guys are missing it, but we're in a different room we got a window. We can actually see outside. So I'm sitting there. I want to look too. But, I'll figure it out after class. Anything good or just life? What is it? Oh, okay. Washing windows. Seeing where I rank, we got three. Get home today. How's your day, hon? Great. Boy. All right. Are they going to do these windows? All right. Oh, man. All right, let me get the lasso back in here. GFR, I don't know what his GFR is. All right, so be able to calculate GFR and figure out what normal is. So about 1/10 of a liter, though, a minute. And then the other thing we're going to do is connect the dots to how much urine you're pushing out a day, if you will. So as that renal plasma, or as the blood makes its way through, 600 mLs, as we said, is potentially filterable. 1/5 of it gets dumped into the capsule, and the remaining just makes its way through the, those peritubular capillaries and into the venous system that we talked about. So those are the basic numbers. As far as on a minute-to-minute nephron kind of level, if you will. In the big picture, though, the common theme, this filtration system takes everything, dumps it in the nephron, but pulls back 99% of it. So your sodium, your glucose, all that stuff, a majority of it comes back. Same thing with the fluid itself. So essentially, the body, as it goes through this whole loop, is pulling back the H2O too as well. So every minute, you may be putting out 1 to 2 mLs per minute, if you will, as far as a grand total. So, 1%, 1.5% of your total filtration is actually forming urine. So the other term in there, filtration fraction, this really is just kind of representing, we said, okay, what's normal of GFR, as far as how much is getting filtered, and we use that number as 20%. Filtration fraction would be kind of a clinical value to say filtration, value is going down or going up. Pathology that makes the thing, let as much protein and red blood cells and everything get in there. You've got a, increased filtration fraction. Something shutting it down, not letting anything get through, obviously have a decreased filtration fraction. So that's just kind of connecting the dynamics to, as we said, as far as GFR goes. All right, so in the big picture, here's all the fun facts of what you do in a day. So if you think about it, if you do the math, 180 liters a day this filtering system is doing. So that's pretty massive, pretty impressive if you think about that. 180 Coke bottles lined up on the table is running through those 2 little 4-inch, kidneys. So pretty engineering-based again, how to accomplish that. But output a day, 1 to 2 Coke bottles, again, depending how well you're hydrated and all that stuff and where your physiology is landing. So, again, you get close to that 1.5% as far as in the big picture of things. So, meanwhile, 178, 179 getting pushed back and kept in the body. So those are kind of your gross, big picture fun facts, but be able to kind of break down at a filter level each step of the game as far as blood flow, plasma flow, and the GFR fraction of it. All right, so regulating this thing. This thing's a filter. That's what it's all about. We need to dynamically, it's not a static Webb filter. It's got the ability to adapt to whatever's going on in your physiology, and whatever's going on in the nephron, it's going to adapt to. So it's got mechanisms to do that. But the not simplistic, but obviously the first front line is the amount of blood going through there is going to determine or have an effect on GFR. So obviously, if you have decreased blood flow, your GFR is going to go down. You have too much blood flow, too much pressure, GFR is going to go up. So those two are hand in hand related, if you will. So the body's got mechanisms to adjust for it, and that's what I think the next couple of slides are to talk about. You got the entertainment. So here's increase, showing the nice big fat arrows, and there's your GFR increase. All right, so regulating this thing. This kidney, if you think, as I said earlier, it's going to react to what's going on in the capillary, what's arriving at that capillary. It's going to react to what's going on in the nephron. And then the kidney itself is reacting to what the heck's going on in your body, the equilibrium there. So it has some local autoregulation to just monitor what's going on at the, filter level, if you will. And then systemically, you've got your, really it says neuroregulations, but it's basically your sympathetics, your autonomics, and then your hormonal feedback mechanisms. These guys are the big ones that are just telling the kidney what to do based on what's going on in the body's physiology. So they're kind of the big picture systems. The caveat is they're all going on to some degree at any given moment, and usually these guys overtake those local feedback mechanisms. You're going to go through and you'll see, well, doesn't this do this? But then later on, it seems like it's the opposite. And it's the net sum of information that determines what the kidney's going to do. So if the body is screaming for, excreting fluids, it's going to do it regardless of the local control. Or if the body's screaming to retain fluids, elevate BP, it's going to do it regardless of local, feedback control. So let's enter into these guys. Autoregulation. Minute to minute, obviously, just like, well, not just like blood pressure itself, you have variations. And it doesn't make sense for this filter to be so sensitive to every little fluctuation in normal, healthy daily life that goes on. So basically, within kind of a low threshold and an upper threshold, the kidney's ability to react locally can keep that GFR the same. So roughly in the 70, 80 kind of numbers, up to almost 200 kind of numbers. Regardless of what's going on systemically, if you're out running, exerting, or if you're snoozing away and it's dropping way down, the kidneys can kind of keep a steady filter function going on. And it does it through those local auto-regulation controls that we'll chat about in a moment. So this slide gives a nice visual, I think, just to appreciate the green is the GFR. This is representing your pressures. And so at very low pressures, no matter what, that autoregulation can't maintain GFR. But if you get up to those 70, 80 kind of numbers, GFR is going to remain static. So even if you get up to 110, you go out and run 130, 140, 150 pressures, it's staying the same. But eventually, if you get past a certain point and it can't compensate, because that's the word I'm looking for. Once you get too high, it can't, compensate, and you're going to alter kidney function as well. But the name of the game is it kind of keeps it in the zone the best it can early on. All right, so two ways to, generically, let me first back up before the two ways. Essentially, the way it can do this, as I said, locally, that capillary network is determining blood coming in, determines how fast it's just pounding through that filter. So the easiest way is simply to constrict or dilate the entrance at a very local level to maintain the pressure of that capillary bed. I've simplified this. There's an arterial here and there's arterial there. And so now you've got these two things that can constrict and dilate. And just think about it mechanically. If you constrict the first one, you can decrease blood flow and pressure. If you constrict the back one, you can congest it and increase it. So there's a little dynamics going on there that we've sort of simplified. I think it's fair to use the front end as kind of our mental wrapping our head around how the local control works. So that's what I've done. So in very easy, simple terms, if your systemic BP is starting to go up, you go out and run, and you don't need your GFR, ratcheting up. You still want to keep that the same. There's local controls that literally just constrict that, afferent arterial to locally decrease blood flow to that area. So that's a nice, easy mechanism, and GFR stays the same. And then the reverse, if there's a scenario where BP is dropping a little bit too low or down on the lower end, that arterial can dilate and just allow more blood in that capillary to physically push, through and maintain the filtration rate. So that's the generics of it. Two mechanisms we'll talk about to accomplish this. One of them is the muscle of the arteriole, and then the other one is that macula densa that we had chatted about earlier. So the first mechanism's easy. Elevated blood pressure stretches the heck out of that arteriole, so its local reaction is to constrict it. So if it just senses too much pressure, that smooth muscle is gonna constrict down the arteriole and kind of act as a brake or a keep it out kind of mechanism, if you will. So that's very simplistic, but the stretch of the arteriole gives the feedback to constrict it, again, maintaining a nice middle ground for GFR to go through. And obviously the opposite, if it relaxes too much, you're going to get the reverse as far as dilation goes. So if BP isn't enough, it's going to relax that much more to dilate. All right, so that's just the stretch feedback of the smooth muscle, the blood vessel itself. The other feedback is what's going on in the nephron, and that's that whole macula densa. And so the blood coming in can determine filtration, but another way to say, hey, if filtration's going on is how much sodium, the rate of sodium that's going through that nephron. The body will use that as a marker to say, hey, if there's tons of sodium going through a mile a minute, that represents a lot of filtration. If there's hardly any sodium going through the nephron, that represents not much filtration's going on here. So that's what the macula densa do in this DCT. So when those sodium values change, and I think that's what the next one is here. So if you have increased sodium, it's saying there's an increased filtration rate. So what do you want to do? Send feedback to constrict that arteriole. So those are the two ways. The nephron can talk locally, and the blood vessel can talk locally to maintain a nice even GFR at any given moment in time. All right, neuroregulation. This one's fairly easy. This is nothing more than your autonomics, your sympathetics, essentially. So the only thing we're really looking at here is what the sympathetics do. And obviously they're responding, their job, they elevate BP, fight or flight and all that stuff. But essentially, they're going to cause constriction. And so think about this. You have a decrease of blood pressure. And now before, we were trying to maintain GFR from a kidney point of view. But sympathetics are all about the body. They're more worried about what's going on in the body. So if you have a drop in blood pressure, the sympathetics say, we really don't care what's going on filtration-wise. We care about maintaining blood pressure. So what they're going to do is come in and constrict and decrease your filtration rate. And so I think I've got it on the next one. I do. If you think about it, the net result is if you're not filtering much, you're keeping that blood in your body, and you're helping to maintain elevating BP systemically. So, it doesn't make sense if you're trying to elevate BP and keep your body fluids up to have your kidneys filtering more. So the sympathetics are very pro limit filtration or decrease GFR, and you'll see this pattern show up a little bit later on in a moment too. So that's quote-unquote neuroregulation. So that's our first systemic, fighting match. Locally, the nephron's trying to do stuff to maintain GFR. Systemically, the body's going to tell it to do other things. And as I said before, sympathetics will win or systemic win. They always overpower whatever as far as the local version of things. So how does that make sense to exercise-wise? That's easy enough to see. Obviously you don't want huge kidney function going on if there's exertion needed. But the other, clinically, obviously, trauma and the whole issue of survival. So obviously blood loss and that whole sympathetic response that goes on with it, it all goes hand in hand to make sense as far as what you already know about kidney function in those scenarios. So that's neuroregulation. All right. Last two, renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. Nice thing is we've seen this guy before, and a little bit about their countercurrents, these natriuretic peptides. The renin system is essentially, its job is to do what we just talked about. If it's activated, endocrine-wise, it's doing all it can to signal the body to retain fluid and increase blood pressure. Anything that wants to do that is decreasing filtration rate. So right out of the gates, you look at the system functionally and you go, the reaction's going to be to slow GFR, increase any fluid resorption that's going on. I haven't quite talked about it, but when we get to angiotensin II, that's what it does, is you've got things stopping the filtration on the front. Meanwhile, you have things going on in the capillaries to dilate and allow time to reabsorb even more, optimize pulling fluid back and diminish excretion. So that's hormonal regulation. I'm looking at the clock, and you've had a long morning, so I am going to park the bus there, I think, whereas I don't want to spoil you by actually finishing a module. So let's keep tradition to the very end, and we'll get through it all. I feel pretty comfortable on our timing. All right, Worcester, you guys have a great day. Too bad you missed the window washing. Maybe you guys can YouTube it for them or something, I don't know. But take care. In Manchester, you guys have a good day.